Lower the lights. Put on your headphones. This story begins now. Some stories don't begin with a moment. They begin with a presence. A person standing just outside the frame, not calling attention to themselves, not demanding to be remembered. Tonight's story is like that. It isn't loud, that it isn't fast, and it doesn't try to prove anything. It's about a woman whose life was carried in memory, long before it was ever written down. A woman who walked away from one life and quietly held together the lives of others. There are no dramatic confessions here, no final revelations. Just the weight of being there, and what happens when history almost forgets. So settle in, let the day fade back a little, and listen closely to the story of the woman who stood in the back row. There is an old photograph that still survives, long after most of the people in it are gone. It shows a group of men standing shoulder to shoulder, their posture stiff, their faces worn down by time. They are veterans, old soldiers dressed in their best coats for a reunion that took place decades after the war that shaped them. Their beards are gray. Their eyes look tired but proud. Most of them are facing the camera directly. And then there is a woman. She stands slightly behind the others, not centered, not posed to be noticed. Her dress is simple. Her hands are folded the way people fold their hands when they are used to waiting. If you weren't looking carefully, you might miss her altogether. But the men didn't miss her. They never did. At the reunion, someone called out her name. Not loudly, just enough to carry across the small gathering. When she turned, several of the men smiled. One of them tipped his hat. Another reached out and steadied her as she stepped forward. They called her Aunt Lucy. No rank followed her name. No title. No official designation. And yet, among those men, her place was unquestioned. Long before the photograph was taken, before the reunion and the aging uniforms and the stiff joints, Lucy had been someone else entirely. She had been property. She had been owned. She was born in Tennessee, at a time when birth itself could determine whether your life belonged to you or to someone else. There are no surviving records of the day she entered the world, no certificate, no ledger entry that marked her as a person. Only a name passed down later, spoken softly, as if it might break. Lucy grew up learning the rules of silence early. What not to say, where not to look, when to lower her eyes. She learned how to measure time by seasons rather than years, because years meant nothing to people who did not expect their lives to change. Then the war came. At first, it came as noise, distant rumors, men leaving, horses passing through. The land itself seemed to shift, as if it knew something was breaking open. And with the war came movement, armies crossing fields that had once been watched and guarded. One night, Lucy left. No one knows exactly how. No one wrote it down. There is no dramatic account of chains broken or guards fooled. What survives instead is something quieter. The knowledge that she walked away from everything familiar and did not look back. She followed the sound of soldiers. By the time she reached the camp of an Indiana infantry regiment stationed nearby, she was exhausted, hungry, and entirely unsure of what would happen next. The men she encountered wore blue uniforms. They were strangers. They were armed. They could have turned her away. They didn't. Someone gave her water. Someone else offered food. She stayed at the edge of the camp at first, unsure of how long she would be allowed to remain. Days passed, then weeks, and slowly, without ceremony, Lucy became part of the regiment's daily life. She washed bandages. She carried water. She sat beside men who could not sleep because the pain was too sharp or the memories too loud. When battles came, She stayed close enough to help, but far enough to survive. When sickness spread, she worked until her hands ached. No one officially assigned her the role of nurse. There was no paperwork, no oath, no pay recorded in any ledger. She simply did the work that needed doing. And the men noticed. They noticed that she remembered their names, that she spoke to them as people, not bodies, that she stayed when others left. Over time, the younger soldiers began calling her Aunt Lucy, not because she was related to them, but because the name felt right, because it meant safety, familiarity, someone who would still be there when the noise stopped. The war dragged on, year after year. Lucy remained with the regiment through it all. She marched when they marched. She waited when they waited. She learned to live with loss as a constant companion. Men she had cared for disappeared. Others returned changed, quieter than before. Through it all, she stayed. When the war finally ended, the camp dissolved the way camps always do, slowly at first, then all at once. Men packed up their belongings. Orders were given. Paths diverged. Lucy faced another decision. She could have gone south, tried to return to a place that no longer existed in the same way. Instead, she followed the regiment north, not as an official dependent, not as someone listed on any roster. Just as Lucy, they settled in Indiana. The soldiers became civilians again, farmers, laborers, clerks. Lucy found work with some of them, moving between households, helping where she could. The war became something people spoke about less and less, except on certain days, in certain rooms, when memory insisted on being heard. Years passed, then decades. By the time Congress passed a law recognizing the service of wartime nurses, Lucy was no longer young. The law allowed women who had served as nurses during the war to apply for pensions. It was, for many, a long overdue acknowledgement. Lucy applied. The response came back quietly and without apology. There was no record of her service, no official documentation, no proof that she had ever been there. As far as the War Department was concerned, Lucy Higgs Nichols did not exist in the way existence was measured. Her application was denied. She did not protest publicly. She did not write letters or demand explanations. Those who knew her later said she accepted the decision with the same calm she had carried through the war itself. But the men did not accept it. 55 surviving veterans of the regiment came together and signed a petition. They wrote to Congress not as officials, but as witnesses. They testified to what they had seen, to the woman who had bound their wounds, who had stayed with them when no one else had to, who had followed them north when the war was over. They did not argue paperwork, they argued memory. Eventually, Congress listened. Lucy was granted the pension she had earned long before anyone thought to write it down. When she died in 1915, she was buried with full military honors. The men who remained stood as they once had, older now, fewer in number. There was no headstone to mark her grave, no inscription carved into stone, but there were witnesses. And somewhere, an old photograph remained, quiet, patient, waiting for someone to look closely enough to notice the woman standing in the back row. By the time Lucy grew old, the war had begun to feel unreal to the people who talked about it. Stories hardened into speeches. Pain became dates. What had once been lived was now organized into parades, monuments, and carefully worded histories. The country preferred its memory tidy, battles named, victories counted, losses reduced to numbers that could fit inside books. Lucy did not fit inside those books. In Indiana, she lived quietly. She moved slowly as the years added weight to her bones. The men she had once cared for grew old too, though many of them were already marked by the war in ways age only made more visible. They gathered occasionally, on porches, in halls, at reunions where uniforms were brushed off and medals pinned back on. Lucy attended some of these gatherings, but never at the center. She sat where chairs were offered, where she could listen without being asked to perform her memory. When people introduced her, it was often with affection, but little explanation. "This is Aunt Lucy," they'd say, and that was enough. But time has a way of thinning the crowd. Each year, fewer men returned for reunions. Names disappeared from rolls. Familiar faces stopped appearing. Lucy noticed these absences more than anyone. She had been present when many of those men were young, frightened, and far from home. She remembered them before the war made them symbols. When Congress passed the Army Nurses Pension Act in 1892, it arrived quietly, like most acts of recognition do, long after the need has passed. The law was meant to provide financial support to women who had served as nurses during the Civil War. It was an acknowledgement that care, too, had been a form of service. Lucy learned about the act not through newspapers, but through conversation. Someone mentioned it at a gathering. Someone else suggested she should apply. At first, she dismissed the idea, not because she doubted her service, but because she had learned long ago that recognition often came with conditions she could not meet. Eventually, she applied anyway. The application required details, names, dates, affiliations. It asked for proof that could be verified. Lucy provided what she could. She named the regiment. She described her work. She trusted that memory might count for something. Weeks passed, then months. The response from the War Department was brief and impersonal. There was no record of her service, no documentation connecting her name to the regiment. Without official evidence, the claim could not be approved. The denial did not accuse her of lying. It did not question her character. It simply erased her. For the government, it was a matter of missing paperwork. For Lucy, it was a familiar feeling, being present, being useful, being essential, and still being unseen. Those close to her later said she accepted the decision with composure. She did not dwell on it. She did not argue. She continued living as she always had, quietly, with dignity, without complaint. But the men noticed something shift. They had grown accustomed to a world that thanked them for their service. They had marched in parades, received pensions, and been addressed as veterans. Many of them carried the comfort of knowing their sacrifices were officially recognized. Lucy had carried them, and yet nothing carried her. The idea that her service could simply vanish because it had never been written down unsettled them. They began talking among themselves, first cautiously, then with increasing resolve. They remembered the nights she had stayed awake, tending to the wounded. The mornings she had risen before anyone else. The way she had followed them north when she had every reason to disappear into anonymity. They remembered because they had been there. Eventually, 55 surviving members of the regiment signed a petition. Some signed with steady hands. Others struggled, their names trembling on the page. Together, they wrote to Congress not as soldiers seeking favor, but as witnesses correcting an omission. They did not embellish. They did not dramatize. They stated facts as they remembered them. They testified to Lucy's presence, her labor, her loyalty. They asked plainly that she be granted the pension she had earned in ways no ledger had bothered to record. The petition took time to move through the system. Bureaucracy is slow by nature, and memory is rarely treated as evidence. But something about the collective weight of those signatures, men who had already proven their credibility, forced the issue to be reconsidered. Eventually, the decision was reversed. Lucy was granted her pension. There was no public ceremony. No announcement made headlines. The recognition arrived quietly, folded into official correspondence. But to those who understood what it meant, it was monumental. It was proof that memory could, sometimes, push its way into history. In 1898, Lucy attended a reunion of the regiment. By then, she was well known among the veterans. Someone suggested she join them for a photograph. She hesitated, then agreed. That is the photograph that remains. The men stand in rows, their expressions solemn. Lucy stands slightly behind them, not posed as the subject, but not hidden either. Her presence feels deliberate, as if she belongs there because she does, and not because anyone arranged it. She looks older than she did during the war, of course. Everyone does. But there is something steady in the way she stands. Something unassuming, but unmovable. It is tempting to see that photograph as closure. Proof that she was remembered, honored, included. But photographs only capture what fits inside their frame. Lucy lived several more years after the reunion. She watched more men disappear. She carried fewer names with each passing season. When she died in 1915, she was buried in New Albany, Indiana. She received full military honors. A flag was present. Soldiers stood in formation. Commands were given. Salutes were rendered. The ritual was precise, practiced, and solemn. And then it was over. Lucy was laid to rest in an unmarked grave. No stone bore her name. No dates were carved into the earth to anchor her story. Anyone passing by would have seen nothing unusual, just ground, quiet and unremarkable. The records would show a pension approved late, an honorary induction granted once, a burial with honors. But they would not show her hands working by lamplight. They would not show her walking away from slavery. They would not show her staying when leaving would have been easier. Those things lived only in memory. And memory, as Lucy's life had proven again and again, was fragile. But sometimes, if enough people held it at once, it could change what history was willing to admit. There are graves you notice because they are marked. They have stone and dates and names carefully carved to resist forgetting. People stop in front of them, read what is written, and feel they have learned something simply by standing there. And then there are graves you pass without knowing. Lucy Higgs Nichols rests in one of those places. If you were to walk through the cemetery in New Albany today, you would see rows of headstones arranged like sentences written in stone. Veterans lie beneath many of them, their service summarized in a few clean lines. Rank, regiment, war, dates. Enough information to make memory feel complete. Lucy's grave offers none of that. There is no marker to signal that a woman who escaped slavery lies there. No inscription to explain that she followed a regiment into war and stayed until the end. No indication that she was once called Aunt Lucy by men who trusted her with their lives. The ground above her is quiet, and perhaps that is fitting. Lucy lived a life defined by what did not insist on being seen. She worked in the background. She stayed when she was not required to. She carried pain that did not belong to her and never demanded acknowledgement in return. In the final years of her life, she moved slowly. Her hands, once steady and tireless, trembled slightly. The world around her had changed in ways she could not have imagined when she first walked away from Tennessee. Slavery had ended. The country spoke openly about freedom now, though not always honestly. Sometimes people asked her about the war. They wanted stories, battles, chaos, danger. Lucy rarely gave them what they expected. She spoke instead about small things. The sound of boots in the morning. The way men tried to joke when they were afraid. The quiet that followed cannon fire. She did not speak of herself as brave. She spoke of necessity. When she died in 1915, the men who remained made sure she was honored. They arranged for military rites. They stood in formation once more, older and fewer, but still upright when the commands were given. For a moment, the war returned to them, not as noise but as memory. The flag was folded, the salutes were rendered, and then slowly the men drifted away. Each of them carried a version of Lucy with them, slightly different, shaped by where and how they had known her. No one arranged for a headstone. Perhaps they assumed someone else would. Perhaps they believed the honors were enough. Or perhaps, after a lifetime of seeing Lucy move quietly through the world, it felt wrong to mark her resting place with something that demanded attention. Years passed. The men died. The reunion stopped. The photograph faded. History continued forward, selecting what it would remember and what it would let slip away. Lucy's name appeared occasionally in footnotes, in local records, in stories told by people who had heard them from someone else. But mostly, she lived in absence, in the space where records should have been. And yet, the fact that her story survives at all is not accidental. It survives because 55 men refused to let memory be dismissed as insufficient. Because they signed their names to a truth that could not be proven in ink alone. Because they understood something the record keepers did not. That some lives are documented not by paperwork, but by the people who were changed by them. Lucy did not leave behind children. She did not publish memoirs. She did not shape history in ways that could be easily measured. What she left behind instead was a pattern. She left behind men who remembered how it felt to be cared for when they were most vulnerable. She left behind a reminder that service does not always come with a uniform or a rank. And she left behind a quiet question that still hangs in the air long after the last witness has gone. What does it mean to be remembered? Is it enough to be known by those who were there, even if the world forgets? Does recognition matter if it arrives late, after most of the living proof has vanished? And who decides which lives are recorded and which are allowed to fade into the margins? Lucy's life does not offer easy answers. It offers something else instead, a stillness. A sense that history is not just what survives in archives, but what is carried forward in silence, in loyalty, in refusal to forget. Somewhere, an old photograph remains. In it, a woman stands just behind a line of aging soldiers. She is not posed as the subject. She does not draw attention to herself. And yet, once you see her, you cannot unsee her. She is part of the story, whether the records say so or not. And tonight, as you listen to this and let the day finally fall away, it's worth holding on to one last thought. There are lives that never ask to be remembered loudly. They only ask not to be erased. Lucy Higgs Nichols was one of them. When the sound fades and the story ends, what remains isn't always the details. Sometimes it's a feeling, a quiet question, a name that lingers longer than expected. Lucy didn't leave behind monuments. She didn't leave behind records strong enough to protect her. What she left behind were people who remembered. And maybe that's enough, or maybe it's not. Tonight, as you rest, it's worth asking yourself, who in your life did important work, without recognition, who stood just outside the frame, making sure others survived. Some lives don't echo loudly through history. They wait patiently for someone willing to listen after dark. Kindly like and subscribe to this channel. Good night, and thank you for listening.